Commissioner Thompson, Commissioner Davey, Commissioner Daniel Favors, Commissioner Mata, and Commissioner Bermudez, along with myself, of course, Commissioner Jones Austin. Welcome, everybody. And we have special guests, so we're going to get some of the standard business, standing business out of the way, and then get to our guests. This is the first meeting of the Racial Justice Commission since the release of our report, the staff report, an interim report from Racial Justice Commission staff. And I just want to take a moment to commend the staff on the report, the many hours that were put into it. Essentially, it captures, indeed, thank you, Commissioner Mata, giving you applause, and they are so deserving. The report really reflects the hard work of the staff and the hours that you put into summarizing what we heard and the work of the commission to date. And I also want to thank the commissioners for being present in those community meetings when we heard from the community. And I want to know from you all if you have heard any feedback from community members and stakeholders. I will tell you that in general, I actually have been surprised by the number of people who have told me that they have read the report and they've had favorable things to say, that it appears that we've captured not only the voice of the community and the concerns raised by the community, but also that we have helped to cast a vision to show and demonstrate that our intentions are to address systemic structural racism and not just center on specific programs and policies. And they've been very heartened by that. We have gotten some feedback, people asking for specific changes that they want to see them, people questioning why solutions weren't presented in the report, but that wasn't the intention of this report. This first report was to essentially share what we've learned today, what we've heard and what we've learned today. And so again, I want to commend the staff for their efforts to produce the report and the commissioners for leaning in and being a part of the effort. The staff also launched a new website and hosted a successful briefing for community organizations who wanted to learn more about the report and the commission's work overall. I just want to remind everybody of the new website address, or tell you if you haven't heard it, it's nyc.gov/racial justice. nyc.gov/racial justice. In the upcoming weeks, the commission and the staff will again engage with the public virtually and in person to gain additional information, garner additional input that will be crucial for our solutions building. And you'll hear more specifics about that just a little later in this meeting today. I commended the staff, said a word or two about the commissioners, but I just want to say a little bit more about the commissioners. You've been at this work now for better than 6 months, and we've asked a lot of you, a lot of your time, a lot of your thoughts, to help shape and inform where we are and where we're going. And I can't thank you enough for staying the course. We now have, I guess a little less than 8 weeks to complete this work, or I should say complete complete the work that will take us to the first set of proposals for this city to help to upend structural racism as it's embedded in our charter. And so I just want to acknowledge all the time that you put into this effort. It's been a great deal of time, and I hope that you find that it has been value add. We're very appreciative of the thoughts, your ideas, the concerns that you brought to the table. And so we just want you to know that we appreciate it. We're in this kind of final stretch, a lot of work to be done, and we just hope that you will stay the course with us. We know that you will, because you've been committed thus far. So today we are going to hear from the Executive Director of the Task Force on Racial Inclusion and Equity. The Task Force Executive Director is Sadia Sherman, and she'll present recommendations from the task force. We're also going to hear from Dr. Taurean Easterling, who is the first Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And Dr. Taurean Easterling will be presenting some of their recommendations that they'd like the Charter Review Commission to take up as well. And then we're going to go over the upcoming public engagement schedule. But first, before we do that, we just need to take a minute or two to review and approve the minutes from our last meeting, which was September 27, 2021. The meeting minutes were distributed in advance and posted on the website. I hope that all commissioners have had the opportunity to review them. And what I'll do is just take a minute right now, in case you haven't had an opportunity for you to take a look at them. They've been shared with you, and as I said, they're also posted on the website. And then I'm going to ask for a motion to approve the minutes in the second, and then we'll do a roll call vote. All right, may I have a motion to approve the September 27th, 2021 minutes?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Thank you. Any questions, comments, any changes? Okay, seeing no hands and hearing none, I'm going to do a roll call, call the names of each commissioner and ask for your vote. So, beginning with Commissioner Mata. Will you approve, Commissioner Mata?
Yes, I approve. Sorry, I didn't know I was in mute.
Commissioner Bermudez?
I approve.
Commissioner Davey?
Approve.
Commissioner Thompson?
Approve.
Commissioner Daniel Favors?
I approve.
Thank you, and I approve as well. So the minutes of the September 27th meeting have been approved. We're now going to turn to our Director of Policy, who will introduce our guests for this afternoon and walk us through what we're going to be hearing and what he'd like us to do for the next little while. Jimmy?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioners, for attending this meeting today, and thank you for our guests for joining us. In the next portion of this meeting, we're going to be hearing two sets of recommendations from city leaders. As you all know, we offered city agencies the opportunity to submit recommendations to the Commission for consideration, and we very much appreciate the ideas and thoughts from the leaders across the city. And today, we're very pleased to introduce two leaders in racial equity and racial justice within city government, who are here to share a selection of the recommendations that the Commission has received. So these two groups presenting undertook a thoughtful process to hear ideas and develop recommendations and offer a list of proposals. They'll tell you about their process, and I urge you to give them close attention and thought, considering how much effort went into these ideas. After the meeting, we'll make sure that you have their proposals in written form so you can review them a little more closely. We're inviting them here to speak to you and highlight the recommendations that they want to discuss with you and with the public. And after each person presents, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of them. So first, I'm really pleased to introduce Sadia Sherman. Sadia is the Executive Vice President for Community Engagement and Partnerships at NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority. And in this capacity, she oversees a partnership-based collective impact model for engaging and connecting public housing residents to economic opportunities and services across 6 departments. But importantly, in 2020, the mayor has also appointed Sadia as the executive director of the city's task force on racial equity and inclusion, which was launched in response to the racial disparities laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic. And with Executive Director Sherman at the helm, the task force brings together leaders across city agencies to advance new ideas, programs, policies, and initiatives that center equity in the city's ongoing response and ensure that the communities hardest hit by COVID-19 are able to come back stronger. So with that, Executive Director Sherman, if I could invite you to provide some background on the task force and on the process that you undertook to create these recommendations. And then, of course, to share the recommendations themselves, after which, again, we'll have a question and answer session with you.
Please unmute.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And just confirming that everyone can hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
So I'm really pleased to be here on behalf of the task force, and I'm really enthusiastic about the work of the Racial Justice Commission. There's lots of synergy and opportunities, so we're really glad to be presenting this evening. And thank you for that introduction, Jimmy. So just to reiterate, the task force is really a body that emerged in response to the COVID pandemic and the racial disparities that were laid bare here in New York City and certainly nationally. The task force brings together a variety of city leaders. What's unique about the task force is that it really brings together many of the city agency leaders of color, and agencies work across teams and in a interdisciplinary fashion to really execute and implement new projects and initiatives. So there have been over 30 initiatives that have emerged from the task force, everything ranging from support for MWBE programs to our recent announcement on universal college savings or baby bonds. And the work has been really exciting and important to how we address COVID, but most importantly, how we eventually recover. We convened the task force members to develop and share ideas for the Racial Justice Commission. We led 2 what we called idea sprints, which were facilitated brainstorming sessions with a number of breakout discussions and question prompts that ranged from, if you were building government today, what would it look like, to more specific questions about how people understand equity within their organizations or their agencies or within the portfolio that they oversee. From that process, we generated over 200 ideas and worked to really synthesize to those ideas that we're sharing with you today. So this is just, a snapshot of some of the feedback that we received around a few key areas, as well as ideas that can be implemented at an institutional level within city government today and in the future. And so I'm happy to be with you today and share some of those recommendations, particularly in the area of addressing equity within our city workforce, community engagement, as well as establishing a long-term equity infrastructure for the city. So next slide, please. And we can skip that slide. I spoke to that. Great. So I'll just jump right in. So many of our recommendations from task force members really pertain to city employment, and it's not a surprise. It's an internal body, right, that is made up of city employees, and there was a lot of focus on making sure that we're not only addressing equity within our city at large and within the programs and initiatives that we lead, but we're also making sure that it exists within our workforce and within our workplace. Pay equity has been an ongoing issue and is something that the task force has recently tackled. And so some of the issues that were identified in this process were really, identifying that there's not a clear process or enforcement mechanism to ensure that there's equitable pay levels. And there's some complexity to this because civil service titles can be used in many different ways. And so there needs to be a mechanism to ensure that there's constant evaluation to identify pay gaps. There's also an acknowledgement that many of our frontline roles, essential roles, in particular, are low wage relative to the value that they provide to the city. There were discussions about the civil service process and making sure that there are entryways for all New Yorkers, particularly young New Yorkers, to navigate the civil service process. Discussions around really better leveraging lived experience and experience-based exams versus traditional testing to create new pathways for employments and other ways to reduce barriers that limit our workforce from diversifying in certain areas. There were recommendations that pertain to enforcement at agencies to make sure that there's regular professional development and that there are clear career ladders for city agency employees, particularly of color. And then making sure that there are equity goals and there's a way in which the city is enforcing them across organizations. So some of the recommendations that emerged from this discussion were updating the city EEO and anti-discrimination policies to address systemic racism. And I think that this aligns with some of what the RJC has been considering in reading the report. Really, a lot of the ways in which we address discrimination is really at the individual level, but really thinking about how we address it at a systemic level through our policies that protect workers. Really being able to standardize the process for onboarding for city employees, starting at the top with city agency leaders, making sure that everyone has the same understanding of equity, is using the same language, and that this is a core part of being a public servant. It's not a nice to have, and that it is critical to everyone's function in city government to understand racial equity, to begin to adapt anti-racist practices within their work. Really leveraging the newly established Pay Equity Cabinet to serve as an ongoing mechanism to address pay equity across our workforce. So the task force, in partnership with the Commission on Gender Equity and DCAS, have recently established a Pay Equity Cabinet that will work to really support agencies in completing job evaluations, implementing recruitment strategies, and other measures that actually can work to close the pay gap. And so the goal here is to really make sure that that's sustained and that's an ongoing feature of city government. And then establishing goals for agencies around professional development and making sure that that applies across all civil service titles, and that there's a clear way in which employees that we're investing in our workforce, and that there's a clear pathway for employees. Next slide, please. So there was also lots of discussion around community engagement. This is, emerged as a very important topic for task force members. So there's certainly, many features already within the city charter and within city process that are that provide a pathway and a mechanism for community engagement. There are community district needs statements, 197A plans. We have our 10-year capital strategy. Many agencies have community advisory boards and feedback forums. And other mechanisms for community input and shared decision making. And so a lot of the discussion here really focused on making sure that low-income communities, communities of color, communities that have been historically excluded can actually take advantage of those tools in a way that's meaningful. And a lot of this pertains to resources. And so some of the proposed solutions include reducing the barriers to participation, particularly for low-income New Yorkers and New Yorkers of color. There could be a very high bar to civic participation, particularly if you're low income and you're giving your time to be part of working groups and meetings. And there was lots of discussion around making sure that as a standard practice, to the extent that the city is formalizing advisory committees or boards or groups, that there is a way in which we are incentivizing and reducing barriers to participation through reimbursements, incentives, stipends, other forms of compensation to really make sure that we're valuing the time of New Yorkers as they participate in these bodies. There was interest in making sure that we are explicitly considering racial equity in the process for prioritizing capital investments. And so this is actually within the charter, but amending it to actually include that language so that everyone goes through that exercise in building the narrative around capital priorities. And then, there was certainly discussion around community boards and making sure that they're all adequately resourced and equitably resourced relative to the communities that they serve. There can obviously be lots of variation by borough with the resources and the staffing and the support that community boards have, particularly their ability to participate in planning exercises and having that resource. And so, making sure that community boards in particular are equitably resources and that communities that have been historically excluded have the capacity and the technical assistance to participate in the tools that are available. Next slide, please. And then racial equity infrastructure. So, underpinning all of these recommendations, the ones that I've shared today and many of the other ideas that came from subcommittee members and task force members, really was this need for an infrastructure within city government to really centralize accountability around racial equity and make sure that racial equity is upheld across all of our processes and policies across city government. Also making sure that agencies have the tools that they need, they have the resources, they have the training, there's enforcement mechanisms, and there's ways in which we are supporting agencies to reach these goals and helping them establish that goal. So some of the proposed solutions were to really establish the task force as a permanent office within city government and charge it with dismantling structural racism within government and within the city programs that we serve. And that would be really leveraging a lot of the work that's already underway within, the task force structure, but also activating agencies to pull the various levers that they control to really implement and execute on the goals that come out of the task force. There's also, was a goal around really just establishing some overarching interagency racial equity goals and using that to inform city budget priorities and decision-making. And then really applying an equity framework to the way in which we roll out programs and services and intentionally building in wealth and ownership opportunities in programs that particularly serve low-income communities of color. So there have been some examples of this in task force initiatives, such as the college savings or the equitable ownership strategy, which requires a certain percentage of ownership by MWBEs and nonprofits in affordable housing deals. And there are some other task force initiatives that have that component. And so there were recommendations around making sure that this is a way in which we consistently approach our work when we're rolling out any program or service within the city, that we try to identify ownership and wealth building opportunities for low-income New Yorkers and New Yorkers of color. Next slide. So that concludes my presentation. Happy to take some questions, and our contact information is there for more information as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Very, very, very happy to hear what you've been doing. We've heard of your work even before the commission began. And so we appreciate having the opportunity to listen to you and to learn from you. And now what we're going to do is engage in dialogue with you. And so I will defer to other commissioners first, and then come back. So if there are commissioners who have questions, please begin. And I'm looking just, if you can let me know that you have a question by raising your hand, then we will go to you. I will go to you. Let's see. Okay, Commissioner Davey.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks for the presentation, today. I really appreciate it. I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about the discussions around making the task force a permanent entity within the city. How did that, where can you talk about where those discussions were had? And then I wasn't clear about what the conclusion was. So can you talk a little bit more about that and how that was reached?
Sure. So the task force is a permanent task force via executive order. So that has already happened. And I think that the next step would really be based on what was shared is resourcing the task force as an office. So so those conversations are actually current, active as we speak, and certainly have been reflected in some of the feedback that we've received in this exercise, as well as some of the other agency feedback. But the task force itself was made a permanent body early this year, actually. So every mayor will need to convene a task force for this purpose. And I think as we've gone through this exercise, we've discussed charging the task force essentially with more responsibility and supporting agencies around this internal equity work through more resources in an office and staffing to execute that. And so those conversations are happening as we speak.
Oh, great, thank you. I'm just curious though, can an executive order actually make an office permanent, or is there some other mechanism by which they did that?
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, so it is by executive order presently, and you're correct. And I think the lawyers can weigh in, but I think mayors can change executive orders. I think that there's a lot of internal support for this work, and across agencies have been very committed to this work. But that is certainly an important point.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
And the next mayor could undo the task force but we could look at institutionalizing it or mandating it through the charter on a permanent basis.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Daniel Favors?
Actually, Chair, that was one of my follow-up questions, was whether or not institutionalizing this, the task force as a permanent agency would be within our purview. Because we all know the beauty of executive orders is that they exist, and the horror of executive orders is that they exist and can be undone with a subsequent change of will from within the same person who executed the order, as certainly it can be with those who follow in that position. So thank you for clarifying that. And I was just lowering my hand right when you called on me. So thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Yes, I have several. Since I was part of the commission today, great to see you again. So one of the things that we are looking at or should be concerned with is, sort of duplication of functions, or is there a better way of streamlining this, right? So can you comment a little bit of an idea such as this? Could the racial justice work of the tree be sort of embedded in or made part of, for example, the Commission of Human Rights that we already have, right? Like, how do we, since racial justice, to me at least, is a human right, couldn't that be just combined into an existing entity that then doesn't require a creation of something else through the charter or any other way? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's interesting because the Commission on Human Rights has this enforcement mechanism built into it. I mean, I think that, TREE has been like multifunctional, and firsthand. So I think there's one is that it really has this internal focus within city government, right? Of really activating projects, which is different from the way the commission would work or works today.
Works now.
So there's a piece of like activating city agency leaders to implement projects immediately, get past red tape, push things forward quickly. And then there's the second layer of, and I think this is a lot of the way in which the direction of the work of TREE has been moving, is really to start to focus on like practice within agencies, capacity building, support for agencies, and really implementing racial equity within their work and addressing racial, like looking at their data in a way that addresses racial bias, understanding disparities. So there is this like very internal piece of TREE, and then there's like this external, which is really like project or initiative focused work, which is community-based. The last piece of it is that TREE has also recently launched these community-based coalitions in the 33 most impacted neighborhoods. So now there's like a community focus side as well too, where there's this constant feedback loop. So I think that there's lots of synergy across existing arms of government, because there is a commitment to equity in many of the functions that we have in government today. I think the spot that TREE has filled has really been bringing agencies together, really in a crisis, and responding quickly. And how do we maintain that, essentially that form of working, but then also begin to institutionalize the work more within agencies. So the TREE as it exists today is again continuing in that fashion, and the idea of supporting it to grow would really be to support agencies really in more of the implementation work.
Thanks, because I see your point of like CHR has been more of an enforcement type of approach. Then TREE has a different, set of both, resources as well as a slightly different bend. But it all seems to be on a continuum. So I want to think through also how it can all fit together, maybe not necessarily under one entity, but a series of entities under one other roof or something. Something that I think we do need to create a little more synergy around. As to the recommendation number one, can you talk a little more about how this is all related? Because from personal experience as a city agency, we're very constrained based on collective bargaining and civil service processes to achieve what you're suggesting, which we would love to achieve, right? Have you contended, how you contended with that? And are there any suggestions of where we might look? I don't know if Commissioner Garrido is with us, but if he were, I'm sure he would be weighing in too. So.
Yes, so this is a really important issue. So there's two ways in which there was a working group subcommittee in the task force, which was focused on pay equity. And I think for everyone's awareness and benefit, the way the task forces function are these like interdisciplinary subcommittees. So there was a subcommittee around pay equity. And I think there's sort of two ways in which to address it. One is, when you look at titles that are subject to civil service, there's actually not that much of a gap because so much of it is formulaic. When you look at titles that are managerial or provisional, that's where you see more of a gap, where there's more latitude. So some of the recommendations are to formalize, and we are moving forward with this, which is exciting, is to actually go through a formal job evaluation process, which is what other municipalities have done when they are addressing pay equity. So it's less about the civil service title of the position, but it's really an assessment of the value of the job and the work. That would then lead to recommendations that can inform compensation. And obviously there are budget implications for this too, which is why the Pay Equity Cabinet would includes OMB and other agencies that would be part of that decision-making. There's also this component of occupational segregation where some of the pay equity, some of the gaps exist by virtue of who's in jobs, right? So the jobs, people are being compensated equally in their titles within jobs, but there are jobs that are dominated by white men or jobs that are dominated by women of color, for instance, right? And so there's recommendations that have also been made around recruitment strategies to increase diversity, reducing barriers around certain positions, pursuing potentially blind recruitment and other strategies that would also address some of the segregation within particular occupations. So this builds on local law 18 and the requirement to do this annual assessment, and would take it a step further to really dig in deeper on like what the real disparities are by the titles and assessing the actual jobs.
Great, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Commissioner Mata?
Hi. So I had a question about the organizing that's happening around that. I know one of the recommendations, I believe recommendation number 2, it talks about community engagement. And I love the fact that you also have in mind of compensating individuals, right, when they are part of these specific groups, because as we know, a majority of our community is like one of the most impacted, and for them to take a day off of work and do this type of work is very difficult, right? So, and I know you mentioned that there's 33 groups right now forming in the areas that have been the most impacted. So I guess my question is like, I'm interested in knowing the organizing around that. Like, how are these meetings being held, or how do they plan to be held? Like, who will be conducting these meetings? Will there be a specific agency, or will it be the community itself? And also, would there also be an educating process along the way? Because I know when I conduct like meetings with the community, I need to start first like educating them on the issue, and then letting them know how the process will go. So I want to hear more about that. How is the organizing happening around this?
Sure. So, and thank you, Commissioner. So, the 33 groups that are forming or have recently formed, these are neighborhood coalitions. So we actually would support, so this is a project in partnership with the Civic Engagement Commission and the Young Men's Initiative, essentially release a solicitation for community coalitions existing or forming to have essentially funding and support to do the work that they're doing. So there's a lead organization that's facilitating the meeting and helping to structure. There are certain activities that they're supporting, particularly around vaccine outreach and education, at least right now. And then they'll be leading a participatory budgeting process in their neighborhood with like an allotted amount of money that they can put towards that work. Those are all being led directly by the community coalition. So the role of the city in that project and the role of the task force is support, resources, some framework for, to your point, like how people should be invited, how they should participate, amplifying and advertising the information that they have. But those are all being led directly by community groups themselves, and some of whom were already coalitions, and this is enhancing their work. The recommendations that came from the task force were aligned from when the city is leading, building an advisory group or a body of sorts, that there be a standard practice, that there's some way in which we're addressing people giving their time to participate and reducing the barriers for that. And I'd be happy to share more information about the coalitions offline if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Someone's in my house. Thank you. If whoever was controlling the screens can put up the equity slide just once more. I have a question specifically about that. I want to zero in on something. The pay equity slide. Is this it? Yes. Okay. When I looking at this, the second issue, one of the things that I was centering on, that I was crosswalking this with in my mind with the City Council's recent report on hiring, and then there's a national report on hiring and the experience that Black women have in particular. And one of the things that I centered on in the national report is the ideas around blind scoring of applications, before you get to interviews. Were you focused solely on pay equity? Well, I mean, I'm appreciating that your recommendation is to foster work environments around recruitment and hiring as well as pay equity. But did any of your recommendations, did you go deeper in looking at how to even address issues centered on actual recruitment and hiring in addition to pay equity?
I'm very glad you raised that, Commissioner. Yes. So there are, I touched upon pay equity, but within the pay equity framework in the cabinet, blind recruitment was actually the first recommendation. So part of the work that the cabinet will take over is not only this job evaluation, there's a whole work stream around instituting a blind recruitment process and supporting agencies in doing that. And there's some technology solutions to explore as part of that work stream. There are recommendations around upskilling city agency HR departments. There are a number of recommendations that came from that, but blind recruitment was the first on the list.
Got it. Very, very helpful. That was pretty much it for me. I mean, there are tons of other thoughts and questions that I think that we probably should spend some more time with you on the whole and just delve more deeply into your recommendations and how they can, even the task force itself and its legal establishment. It in some ways, it mirrors some of the thinking that we've been having around how to ensure on a continuing basis attention to and adherence to recommendations that are brought forward and then essentially, through the charter made law. But I think there'd be value add in continuing the conversation. And tell me a little bit about, is there an actual report that we can lean into?
For the recommendations or on the, so there is, I'm sorry?
On the whole, is there a report with your recommendation?
Sure. So we have a paper with backup information on the recommendations, so I can share that.
Okay. And has that been given to the staff already?
An earlier version of it. So we'll share the final. So we'll share that, and then just on the task force overall, there's a report, but we'll share the backup for the recommendations.
Good deal. Thank you, Commissioner Bermudez.
I forgot to ask could you say a little more about one of your potential solutions in that the pay equity and in that slide was to revise the city's EEO policies, I believe, or something like that.
So one of the recommendations there were some recent updates around to the city EEO policy. But it was to revisit the EEO policies and anti-discrimination policies to identify whether there's a way to address systemic racism versus only individual behavior. And so that may not be exclusive to city employees, right? Like there may be a way to evaluate that in the context of New Yorkers in the workforce overall. But that was essentially seeing if there's an opportunity to take our anti-discrimination and EEO policies further by addressing systemic issues.
Great. Okay, thanks.
I'm looking to see if there are other questions. What I have to share with you is that even though we may not have a lot of questions at this point, Director Sherman, we have had quite a few, but we may very well be coming back to the well. Just want to digest all that you've shared and get a copy, if we may have it, of the most recent report. And then we will be back to you, I'm sure of it.
Great, thank you so much.
We really appreciate your spending time with us this afternoon. And I just want to make sure that I'm just going to do another quick kind of round robin. I think we are good to go. Is there anything that you want to share with us as we wrap up? Anything additional?
No, thank you. And thank you for taking this work on. It's really important and exciting. And so, I'm happy to meet with you all and support. And I'll be listening into the remainder of the meeting. So thanks.
I'm appreciating
Sherman,
because Commissioner Daniel Favors has raised her hand. So
yes, thank you for that, Co-Chair. You're very quick at this. I'm so sorry. I believe you may have mentioned this. I just wanted to ask and clarify if the last point that you addressed about hiring also extended to retention. And I apologize if you mentioned that and I missed it, but I just wanted to get confirmation about that.
Sure. So there were recommendations around blind recruitment in the hiring process. There are also recommendations to around the city's promotion policy as well too. So there are some recommendations that pertain to retention, promotion, and as well as our internal HR practices.
very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Sherman. Very much appreciate you and all that you're doing. On top of your work that you've done through the years. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see. Director Pan, do you want to set us up for our next conversation?
Sure, and thank you so much again, Executive Director Sherman, for all the work the task force has done. I cannot understate how much work they put in to collect these recommendations and present them to us. And so we're very, very grateful for your partnership in that. I'm really pleased now to introduce Dr. Taurean Easterling. Just give a quick bio. Dr. Easterling is the first Deputy Commissioner at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And in this role, he is the agency's top deputy and plays a chief coordinating role for health matters for the agency. And then in addition to serving as the second in command at the department, Dr. Easterling also serves as its inaugural chief equity officer, unifying and directing the department's internal and external equity agenda. Previously, Dr. Easterling served as the deputy commissioner of the Center for Health Equity and Community Wellness at the Health Department, which uses a racial and social justice approach to eliminate health inequities for those who are most marginalized in New York City and to reduce overall premature mortality from the leading causes of preventable death. So Dr. Easterling, if I could also ask you to provide a quick background on the process that was conducted by the Department of Health to create these recommendations and then share the recommendations themselves. And again, afterward, we'll have a extensive Q&A session like the one we just had. So with that, thank you for joining us.
And before you begin, I just have to do something that I've never been able to do before, but now I can. You are, you don't just play a doctor on TV, you are a doctor. It's been good seeing you and hearing you talk about the importance of people becoming vaccinated for COVID-19. And thank you for that. Thank you for all you're doing. Never got to say that before.
No, that was a great intro. That was more important. But I am a doctor in real life, so I thank you. But I do want to say thank you to all of the commissioners and all of the staff. This has been tremendous work just to really witness and watch it even from the sidelines. Certainly there's been an extensive and intentional practice in generating public input. And so it is really an honor to be joining you all this afternoon to share some of the work of the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and also lift up ways in which we can really think about how we advance a racially just recovery from COVID-19 and think about the policies going forward. I do quickly want to acknowledge and thank Grace Bonilla, who was the first executive director of the Task Force for Racial Inclusion and Equity, and also our current executive director, who we just heard from, and is really leading our agencies, as I already mentioned, towards a path of racially just recovery from COVID-19, but also helping us and stewarding us to implement really important policies that end structural racism. And so thanks to Director Sherman for her leadership and her partnership, both in overall work of the task force, but certainly as we have been partnering together to really ensure that our vaccination campaign has been equitable. And so I'll jump into my slides. And part of my intro, I think it is important for the commissioners to know that I think this presentation is really building on decades of work that we've been doing at the health department, and certainly during this administration, to really advance an anti-racism public health agenda. Our practice is really to understand, that the importance of centering health in these conversations is really a matter of life and death. And I don't think we have seen it more clear during this pandemic that all of the intersecting factors that really that people interface with certainly can contribute to their health outcomes. And so again, it is really important and critical that we are having this conversation today, lifting up these recommendations and really thinking about how we can transform the ways in which the city works and certainly our agency. And to that point, we are coming off the heels of a recent passage of a resolution that the New York City Board of Health did yesterday officially pass a resolution that declares racism a public health crisis, but more importantly, is committing the health department to concrete actions. And those concrete actions are important in that we're really taking a deep look at our structures, at our policies, to ensure that we're thinking explicitly how we're advancing that agenda. And so just to give you a flavor of some of the actions that were part of the declaration in this resolution specifically, were ways in which we are thinking about our data. I just alluded to the work that the task force is doing with the health department, both identifying the neighborhoods that have borne the greatest burden of this pandemic, but also using that data to inform our operations. And so you can think about the 33 neighborhoods as a map, as a catchment area, but really how are we bringing all of our resources and all the assets to bear so that we can close the gap. And we've made significant gains over several weeks. In addition, we are also doing an intentional anti-racism review of our own health code. And I don't think many New Yorkers really understand that this health department has its own legal making authority body, not just to change the calories on the menu, but also to think about how we are licensing childcare centers, really also thinking about how we're ensuring the safety from foodborne illnesses by grading our restaurants. And there's so much more that our New York City Board of Health has authority over. And I really do think it is important that we take a look at what decisions have been made, what policies are in place. And so we are building out an equity analysis that will allow us to examine all of the health codes that are now in place and thinking about going forward. So that's just a flavor of some of the committed actions that the health department will have to assume as a result of the resolution. And we will be providing updates to our New York City Board of Health on a semi-annual basis. And this is going to really ensure that there is accountability to the work that we do. And there's certainly more ways that we've been really thinking about this. But to the matter at hand, and as was already asked, sort of how we've been thinking about these recommendations, we wanted to really think about how our recommendations could measure and address social determinants of health, as we understand, as I mentioned earlier, the intersecting factors of how structural racism can show up in our practices and our policies. We certainly wanted to think about how we can create and strengthen community-based and decision-making power, hold city agency leadership and staff accountable for meetings and the needs of communities, then also require the reproduction of reports that are effective in measuring and communicating on equity indicators across those said social determinants of health. So those are just the ways in which we began to really think about those recommendations. We did a really extensive engagement throughout our agency, really engaging all of our divisions and really thinking about how within those divisions that we also engage staff at all levels and all civil service titles. And so that was really important that we did a really extensive staff engagement while also taking a lot of recommendations through just outreach to staff. And so what we've been able to elevate, we had a total of 12 recommendations, and in partnership with the task force, I've also submitted some of those recommendations to the task force for racial inclusion and equity to consider as well. But this afternoon, I'm going to actually focus on 4 of those recommendations and happy to submit additional documentation so that you can see the full list. So next slide. So in the first recommendation that I'm sharing is really to sort of center values and principles, certainly what we believe and hope that, and what I think the city also believes, in thinking about how we integrate anti-racist, gender neutral and inclusive language in the charter going forward. It certainly reflects the importance and impact on social determinants of health. And so the example here is removing all male pronouns for the commissioner, replacing minority groups, members and women with historically underinvested or underrepresented communities of color, replacing words like mental retardation and substance use with appropriate updated language, and also including race and race explicit strategies in the functions, powers, duties, and policies of the department. And I think it is really important, and this will also sort of get covered in some of the other recommendations, that this last bullet of how intentional and explicit that we can be around transforming the functions of agencies, of offices, to make sure that embedding equity in the work that they do, organizing and operationalizing, which are key pillars for our own internal transformation process, has been really essential, right? So it's not enough for us to just name that this work is important, but really begin to talk about how we're embedding it into our organizational identity so that it can connect to the outcomes that we are achieving. So to the next slide. The second recommendation that I'm lifting up, and this actually connects to my role within the agency and also the vision of our current commissioner. So making permanent the role of the Chief Equity Officer within city agencies, requiring one deputy commissioner or executive deputy commissioner to serve in this capacity, who will be responsible for coordinating and implementing an equity agenda, anti-racist practices, equity-based evaluation and monitoring, and publicly reporting for each agency. In the charter, there is a call out for the heads of agencies and also sort of describing some of the functions of those heads. And I think, to the point that I made earlier, being explicit about the function of really addressing and dismantling structural racism would and should be not only part of this administration, but really embedded into agencies' work. And we know that there have been steps by not only the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, but there have been steps by other agencies to really be explicit in these roles. And certainly some of the functions that we would expect that a chief equity officer to take on, really monitoring the agency's practice to prevent and eliminate existing internal structural conflicts. Certainly, as you've already heard from Director Sherman, really starting to think about how you're embedding some of the equitable workplace practices as well. Certainly, building capacity and training around how you have a shared analysis around structural racism, which are all, I think, are key steps in sort of thinking about how you can take more intentional committed actions around employing an anti-racism practice. Next slide. And this is also building on the previous presentation and the recommendation to make permanent a mayoral office of racial inclusion and equity led by a central chief equity officer. They're requiring one deputy mayor or executive deputy mayor to serve in this capacity to coordinate and implement a citywide equity and anti-racist policy, research, and budget agenda, and produce public reporting on progress to advance citywide equity goals. I think what we've already heard from Director Sherman is the importance of how we operationalize this work. And certainly for this office to really think about also how we are employing what we would call a health in all policies approach and framework. Thinking about how you're centering equity and all of the intersecting factors that allows us to really prioritize equity practices. We know that some of this work is already underway and certainly has been a part of Executive Order number 45 and really thinking about how the city begins to establish standardized metrics so that we can hold our work more accountable. But I think this would be the next step to really think about how not only are we using our data intentionally, using our research intentionally, using our budget, and all of our expanded work would be included here. And the final recommendation that I will share with you, and so I've already mentioned as part of, next slide, I've already mentioned some of the work of the Board of Health, our legal making authority as an agency to really pass and amend any legislative policies for our health code. And so in the spirit of transformative function, but also really to look at how we are modernizing our city charter and all of the different roles that are within city government. We are putting forward a recommendation to restructure requirements regarding Board of Health service in order to diversify membership. And we know that as part of the city charter, really laying out the role of the Department of Health, the role of the commissioner, but the Board of Health is also named within the city charter. And we do think that is really important to begin to, one, modify the requirements and qualifications for the Board of Health to expand on non-physicians, non-master degree members, really make sure that the representation of the board members are reflective of the city as well. And so either the commissioners would either consider thinking about how we restructure the current board or expand the number of board members that will be part of the Board of Health so that we can achieve this recommendation. And so with that, I will pause there and welcome any questions.
I'll just begin by thanking you for both your presentation and for all of the work that has gone into developing these recommendations. I have to think that this is a work that is long in the making and is not just over the course of the last few months, but perhaps the last 8 years. building on the creation of the Center for Health Equity. And it's just tremendous to see. And one of the things that I appreciate most about it is that you are centering on this, the opportunities and the need, not just being specifically like health care, but all of the attendant circumstances. And I really, really appreciate and applaud that. As I was listening, and I'm just going to jump in because I don't see hands up, but you all get your hands up. If can I take liberty, Commissioner Bermudez, and just jump right in? Okay. A few thoughts came to mind. Let me first say that I really do appreciate what you've done. A lot of what you've shared resonates with a lot of what we've already been talking about, but I see the strength of the work and all of the time put into it. This is not charter revision specific, if you will, but I am curious whether DOHMH has documented its efforts, its work over the course of the last 8 years. Is there a roadmap that we can look to? Just curious about that, and you don't have to answer that in this moment, but I do think that that is something worth paying attention to. You mentioned city agencies. You suggest that city agencies each have a deputy commissioner or executive deputy commissioner. I imagine that you're extending that to mayor's offices as well. That's just a simple question, not right. Any
Yes.
entity? Okay, good deal. And I just want to ask you a few questions about that. We had a conversation with a national thought leader on racial justice, and it is that person's opinion that you have to be very careful about setting up people with accountability that seems that then may remove it from the chief, the commander in chief, if you will. And so there was a bit of a back and forth about, well, the commander in chief is going to need people to actually do the work, and then kind of report out, report up. Is that something that you all, spend some time with, whether or not there, and I see that you have this central body, this deputy mayor, who should be over everything, but did you spend any time with the whole accountability and where the buck stops?
Yeah, no, really good question. So to the first question, we are documenting the work of the last 8 years of both our internal transformation work as well as some of our external work. And so we really do hope to put out some of those products by the end of the year. So that's going to be really important to just document what we've been able to do. But then to the most recent question at hand, so we've really thought about sort of the structure itself, but I think it's also important to think about the accountability practice as well. We want to be clear about what the role, the responsibilities and functions of a chief equity officer who would either be in the mayor's office and also within the agency. But it's also important that the head of the agency, the principal, is also communicating that this is a responsibility of everyone. And that it has to be very clear, and that's very clear within the agency, but then also building within the infrastructure some of the accountability tools, which is why passage of our resolution yesterday was really important. And certainly, even as a principal for the agency, coordinating across all of our deputy commissioners to make sure that this work is going to move forward. But we do really have other leaders within the agency ensuring that this work is advancing.
Excellent. Thank you. And I apologize for us not commending you on the passage, the resolution with the declaration that we have a public health crisis. That's a tremendous body of work, and that's a tremendous achievement. And we all should make sure that we avail ourselves of it. I'll make sure that it is shared, the resolution is shared with the commission members, but tremendous, and congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Bermudez.
Thank you, Chair. So first of all, I want to thank you and commend you and all of those things, because your recommendations to us were extremely comprehensive, well thought out, And, love that you get to play a doctor on TV as a doctor. I love watching you because you're very comforting. So it's fantastic. I can say, I know him, so I have essentially a follow-up. Chair Jones-Austin said exactly what the way that I was thinking in terms of accountability is would your kind of suggested structure, if you will, of all, let's say we all our agencies have the chief diversity officer at a high level. I agree with you that it needs to be somebody who essentially reports to the commissioner in their regular course of, business, if you will, because those are the people who are carrying out the work, right? But then is your view then that these folks would have a dotted line, I guess, to the deputy mayor that you suggest? Like how do we ensure that everybody's on the same page, if you will? And then the accountability for look, your agency's not advancing on this. What's up with that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, and I'm glad I haven't thought this all the way through, because I do think we're going to really have to make sure that the structures are in place. But here's me taking a crack at it: that the mayoral office that would be in place, who would be really leading the city's administration, equity agenda. I think it's going to be really clear, sort of having a strategic plan, sort of thinking about what are those accountability tools that we need to put in place, whether they're equity assessments and or sort of additional sort of policies that need to be put in place. And I think that having the task force, and the task force has been really important, as you know, Commissioner, that, we're all coming in, contributing the work that we are already leading, and really having sort of a principle that's making sure that this is moving forward and we have shared goals. And I think the work of our vaccine campaign and certainly the pay equity cabinet is going to sort of be a model for how these cross-agency work groups are going to have to sort of be grounded in, what's the data, really what are the accountability structures, and then making sure that the principals are aware of the objectives. I think at the agency level, one of the things that we've been really thinking about is how do we operationalize our agency strategic plan that could be and should be led by the principal deputy first and the chief equity officer, but ensuring that other senior leaders are also bought into that strategic plan, that there are shared goals, and we all are clear about what sort of what the direction is. I think that those are all ways that we can think about it. But if there's sort of an indirect line from the chief equity officer within the agency to the mayor office, I'm not totally against that. But I do think as long as the commissioner still understands their role, also in advancing an equity agenda, I think is still very important.
Thank you.
To your
Yeah,
question.
no. I mean, a lot of these things are, they're in their kernel, phase, and we will have to wrestle with that as we move along with the commission here to really try to figure out what is the most enduring, operationalizing of all of this.
Are there other commissioners with questions? If not, I'm going to just follow up on another recommendation that you put forward. Let's talk about language. I liked what I read and really appreciated your bringing that forward. What I appreciated. Well, first, I saw the value in it, but I guess I want to center on with you some of the thinking that went into coming up with that, how that ties in with health. Because one of the things that we're going to have to do as we talk about these recommendations and as we bring solutions forward is to help people make the connect. And, it may be more, obvious to some than to others. And so we do have people in the public who listen on these meetings. And I would really appreciate your talking about how language is so critical and how that affects people's health and well-being and the value add of such a proposal.
No, I thank you for the opportunity to even try to reflect on it and really try to provide some clarity on how we think about the importance of addressing social determinants of health, because very much, even though as we center health and health outcomes in our work, and we have to, we are a public health agency. We very much see that our race explicit strategies really are undoing the structural inequities. All right, and it's not just thinking about healthcare access. We're also thinking about food access. We're thinking about education, as you've all already talked about, and certainly thinking about the communities that have been most marginalized, when it's Black, Indigenous, other people of color. Language is important because even as we see through our vaccine campaign, folks need to be able to access service. And we need to make it as simple as making sure that folks feel reflected in the services that are being rendered, but they're also able to understand and comprehend what is available. And we certainly want to ensure that this city charter is reflective of the diversity of the city. And so when we're talking about including anti-racist, gender-neutral language, we're talking about reflecting and centering the people who are very much we're trying to take care of and engage. And this is really about an upstream approach. So, a lot of what we talk about in anti-racism work is how do we focus on those structures and those systems? And all of those systems are intersecting. It's not just race and gender, race and ethnicity, although that's how we really are seeing, a lot of the work being grounded. But we also understand that there are many intersecting factors that are oppressive to many people. And so how are we centering everyone and making sure that they feel inclusive?
Very much appreciate that. Let's talk a little about data, because we've also been centering on how best to collect and use data to hold agencies and staff, leaders accountable as we make these changes. I should say the Department of Health does a lot to disaggregate the data and look at race and gender and other identities. Help us to appreciate how, any thoughts that you may have about how we could do that across the system, structurally.
Yeah, and I certainly am proud of the work that we're doing at the agency. And I know this was also something that was really important for the Task Force for Racial Inclusion and Equity to also lead in, having a data use work group, because there are a couple of things that we're trying to ensure. And certainly how we collect data, keeping individuals' information private, certainly how we operationalize it, making sure that we're using data for the good, and then also how we name those injustices and use it in a way that it can inform our operation so it can close the gap, right? Our outcome is all about how we're achieving our equitable outcomes. And if we are really seeking to do that, then the foundation is what are we doing to really center those who are most marginalized and oppressed? And so the data collection, we certainly have tried to improve the ways in which we capture data, but expand it as well. That is not just thinking about quantitative, but also qualitative. So matching the numbers with the heart and soul. And so it's really about capturing the voices and really engaging our community partners. And I know that one of the commissioners had talked about that community engagement. So, a lot of that we did during COVID-19 response. Certainly the task force did, the health department did, and we can expand the ways that we really collect data, which is really important. Then sort of thinking about how we're storing data, keeping it private, how we're making sure that we're really disaggregating it so we can tell the story, which is really, really, really important, and naming those injustices. So I think it's those three ways that we really have to make sure that we are using data in an intentional way. And I think it is going to be important going forward that city agencies are thinking about how we standardize, how we share data, collaborate more. And I think those are some additional steps that I think even the city charter can certainly think about how we institutionalize it.
I have more questions, but I don't want to dominate. So I don't see any other hands. I'm going to keep going. Let's talk a little bit about the commission, and this is actually a question both for you and for Executive Director Sherman. The commission wants to set up, we want to put forth proposals that are that will be impactful, but in order for them to be impactful, they have to be implementable. And I would appreciate hearing from you, both of you, as you've been centering on this work. What are some of the lessons learned that we should be mindful of as we seek to create changes that would, reverberate across the city of New York and with the city agencies? And I'm speaking to everything from how things are worded, even just the work that you did with the resolution, Dr. Easterling. What are the lessons that you can share with this commission at this point? And the same for you, Executive Director.
Yeah, I think, Chair Jones, also, I think you hit on some of the really important points. I think we want to reflect all our documents in a way that is more inclusive, that really grounds equity in the work that we want to do. And I think that is maybe seen as a small step, but it really is meaningful in so many different ways, because there is some accountability when we can lift up and point to how principals, how heads of agencies are really responsible for advancing the anti-racism agenda. So I do think that not only for the city charter, but ways in which we can reflect this in our executive orders, even some of our data agreements or any type of agreement that we have between agencies. I think it is really important that we have the language to use, and that really reflects the shared analysis of how inequities show up. And so I think it's a really important starting point. And I think that there have been really key examples of how the city has done meaningful community engagement, right? Creating shared spaces where certainly government, along with community, can certainly lead a community coalition or groups so that we can identify what the problems are and concerns. And certainly a lot of it we do know, but certainly even more important is identify the solutions. And we heard very loud and clearly from so many community partners during this pandemic that we're very much part of solutions. So we want to be in the spaces where, we're talking about our contact tracing efforts, that we're talking about our vaccine campaign. And so I think going forward, we're going to have to really think about how we institutionalize that practice, not just for health, but for many of the things that we're doing, all of the different planning processes. I think certainly making sure that we are building out that infrastructure is going to be really key. So I'll leave it there, and I'll welcome Executive Director Sherman to chime in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Taurean, and thank you, Chair. So I'll just build on that point. I think that, some of the lessons learned are like this practice of building this practice, right? So agencies being intentional really across the work that they do from soup to nuts. So looking at your foundational documents and addressing language and going through that exercise in a very intentional way with your leadership, leading that exercise so that everyone is really rooting themselves in the same understanding around the importance of addressing race and racial equity, looking at your data consistently through a lens of race and really examining it in that way. I think we've learned a lot in the vaccination campaign around communicating to communities of color, communicating in ways that are authentic, centering communities of color in the ways in which we build access as well. And I think that there's this component around really revisiting the ways in which we work with communities. So the coalitions are an example of really just like resourcing communities to support the work that they're naturally leading and providing some support in that. And I certainly can share examples from, my NYCHA had of formalizing the way in which we engage residents. We recently entered into an agreement with residents where we've outlined specifically the ways in which we will engage with them, where they have decision-making, where it's mutually negotiated. So I think that there are lots of takeaways and, certainly lots of lessons learned, but I think having like clear buy-in and support from agency leadership is critical, and really building this practice of addressing race and racial inequity in every single, piece of the work of the organization is really foundational and critical.
As you both talked, I couldn't help but think to myself, you've laid out some thoughts about how this work can be centered in the agencies. Perhaps we should be giving some thought to how city agency leaders themselves are hired and appointed, and the role of the chief equity officer in that as well. Just thoughts. Commissioner, thank you. I really appreciate you both. Commissioner Daniel Favors.
Thank you, Chair. I'm apologizing in advance as I'm also at pickup for my daughter at soccer, so you will hear the sounds in the background. My apologies. Very much appreciated hearing from both of you. I am curious, however, about the sustainability of some of the initiatives that have been addressed, particularly because we seem to be in a time when the person in leadership, drawing just a bit on your last comment, Chair, the person in leadership bringing a racial justice lens to this space is obviously very important. The persons or the people who form the leadership. As I'm thinking about what's happening in the current national arena, I am wondering as to your thoughts about the ability to institutionalize these recommendations regardless of the persons who are in leadership for executing them. I'm going back to that thought about the executive order, where with a new administration, the existing recommendations could be executive ordered into non-existence. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the way in which the charter could be in some way used to ensure that regardless of who is sitting in these seats, so that we're not in a situation where racial justice, because it's something that you personally may believe in, how it can be mandated, even if the person sitting in that seat perhaps is not as inclined or frankly as knowledgeable about these issues as the two of you and your current teams are.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I think that's also why, in addition to naming the position, I think we've also wanted to be clear about the role of the office in the work that the office will do. Certainly, just to go back to sort of the mayoral office on racial inclusion and equity, I think, again, building on what the task force would do, but leading with the health and equity on policy, making sure that there is a way in which we're using our research and our budget intentionally with a racial justice lens, so that we are taking the focus off of the role of the person in the position and really building that structure. I think it's a first step, but I do think, again, really expanding those type of roles in that work into the agencies is also important. And I don't want to just talk about the health and equity on policy within the office, because there are ways in which we need to operationalize these tools, and not just sort of the health equity on policy, but also racial equity assessments. Like, what are the ways in which city government should be working so that they can advance a racial justice lens and get to the outcomes? And I think both the office in those tools are just ways. I don't, I think the charter could reflect certainly that type of work.
I would just build on that point. I think that we've also been, bureaucracies can be very difficult to shift. And I think, in ways that can be helpful too, right? If you want to institutionalize work. So I think there's also been a lot of effort to really think about where, these racial equity practices and strategies can be institutionalized in the existing processes within city government, into the ways that people do their work today, right? So that they are really, really not only reaching leadership, but really reaching all levels of an organization, and supported and really invested in by leadership. And so, a lot of the recommendations that came were, big ideas and things that can be addressed through the charter and through leadership and through an office, but also like really, really micro, fine-tuned recommendations that build on what city leaders know about procurement processes or hiring processes, or a lot of the processes that exist within government where there's an opportunity to really embed, these racial equity goals into the day-to-day work.
Very much appreciated. Thank you. I have one other question, something that we haven't centered on, and perhaps, it's something to come back to if you're not at this point able to or ready to apply. When talking, earlier in this process, back in the summer, we met with subject matter experts, thought leaders in different disciplines, and we talked with health professionals, in the field, working at different spaces and places, and there was a lot of centering on specific policy changes in the actual provision of healthcare or in health insurance. And I, for one, perhaps not others, but I, for one, was trying to figure out how do you connect maybe some of these policy changes to underlying structural issues around the actual provision of healthcare as a government entity. And so again, that I may be putting you on the spot right now, but I am curious if you have any thoughts about that, and we can come back to it at a later time, if not. But and again, I very much appreciate the centering that you all are doing on the social determinants of health, because there's some who believe, like my 24-year-old daughter, you can have all the healthcare funding available, but if you're not centering on the social determinants, you may not get but so far. So I put a plug out there for Kennedy Austin. Anyway, shout out. So just curious about that, because we heard a lot about policy, but not really like structural, like what can be done with respect to the actual provision of care.
Yeah, no, this is exactly what we're tackling. And so you're absolutely right. We will have to come back and sort of outline some of the ways in which we're thinking about this. And this is also, again, why, in our own agency restructure, the commissioner did identify a really amazing leader in Dr. Michelle Morris, who was our inaugural chief medical officer. Because one of the things that we've been talking about in our own strategic plan is creating healthier neighborhoods, promoting healthier childhood, and then bridging public health and healthcare. And sort of the continuum allows us to have a place-based focus, think about the life course, right? From childhood all the way up to adults, because we know that family cohesion is super important. And even in thinking about bridging public health and healthcare, we understand that it's really important to think about all the systems that intersect with health. And so even though we call it a health system, we know that healthcare systems interact with food and housing and all the other things that people care about. And so through our strategic plan, we're now identifying, what are those key drivers that we're going to have to address under systems. We know access to health insurance is important, but we also know that there's an opportunity for us to engage health systems around, community benefit plans, that we can really begin to think about how we're engaging non-traditional providers as well. Public health core being one investment that's sort of thinking about expanding our public health infrastructure so that when we talk about access, that individuals having access to community health workforce really extends our ability to connect people to care, but also do an environmental assessment. So those are just some of the ways that we've been thinking about how our systems change work could be reflected in our agency. But that was just a tease, and I think we're going to have to really just sort of come back and share more.
Okay, very much appreciate that. I don't know if we have you for another 2 minutes or so, 3 minutes. Is that doable? Okay.
Let's do it.
Okay, good deal. I see Commissioner Bermudez has her hand up.
Yeah, this is actually less of a necessarily commission work, but some of the conversation, Dr. Easterling, leads me to believe that it's time to meet on our other capacity, on my other capacity from probation, because there's some things we can do together that I think we tried in the past, but I think we're more ready now. So anyway, it's a plug for that, and I'll reach out to your office.
Great.
Good
Hopefully
deal.
that's a plug for the neons and all the great
Yes,
work.
exactly. I mean, it's more confluence with your health equity centers that there's, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you. And I'm going to make my own plug. I think that you need to come on to Open Line and talk about the work, both Executive Director Sherman and Dr. Easterling, especially the resolution just passed. So we're going to have to work on that as well. Question about intersectionality and intersectional issues. When I think about health and healthcare in America, and I think about what is happening, particularly for women of color, do we need to? Would you speak to us a little bit about whether it is enough to just center, as we think about these issues, on race, or should we be doing a little bit of mission creep?
Sorry. Should we be doing mission creep?
Right. I mean, just like centering on that there are intersectional issues here. When we think about the experience of certain communities, and particularly women of color.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's no question there that we will and we're required to have this intersectional lens and really think about the work that we're talking about, a racially just recovery, but what that also means for intersectionality. And so, it's more of how do we ensure that we're bringing in, our work to address, severe maternal mortality and morbidity, and particularly because we know that higher rates of maternal mortality is experienced by Black and Latino women in New York City. So the racial justice lens is there, and we have a responsibility to sort of think about how we're changing those systems as well. So there's no question to me that we do need to expand and ensure that there is an intersectional lens.
Good deal. So much that you've shared, so much that you both have done, and we are we're the better for it as a commission. We ask that we have the opportunity to come back to the two of you as we further delve into the work that you've done, and as we explore other areas where you would likely be helpful to us. So we're going to extend an invitation to you to come back to us, but we're going to ask in turn that you keep your doors open to us as we work to get to the finish line sometime in the next, 6 to 8 weeks. But I want to thank you both on behalf of the commission. You're doing tremendous work, and your work is helping us to get to where we need to be for the city of New York. So thank you both.
Thank you again. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. The commission is now going to hear from our head of public engagement, Harold Miller, about our plans for engaging with the public over the next several weeks.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon to the Commission. It was great to see Sadia and Taurean with a great presentation, great public servants. So exciting work that they're doing. Over the next few weeks, we are continuing our public engagement efforts. I'm just going to give you kind of top lines, and if there's questions, please ask. So on the 8th of November, we're going to be at the Brooklyn Museum for our in-person public session. And then on the 10th, we're going to head up to the Bronx, to the Sonia Sotomayor Community Center. And then we're going to have our virtual meeting on the 18th. Running at the same time, we are, and our partners, consultant partners, are holding focus groups and constituency-based meetings. Some are listed here. Mutual aid groups, community health and well-being, economic development, those justice involved, justice oriented, legal aid, with the immigration focus, arts and culture, youth, LGBTQI, housing, disability justice, environmental and resiliency, and youth and adult education are some of what we're focusing on. And then also we've been doing a series of presentations to community boards around the city. So far we had met with 7 community boards. I'm going to meet with community board 16 tonight. They are averaging about 46 participants per community board. So we have spoken to roughly over 300 members of the community board and the public presenting on our work. So that work is going to continue. We have another dozen or so community boards already scheduled and more to come, along with other community-based organizations, arts organizations, and other groups that we are talking to. One last piece, I'm not sure if there's a slide for it, but we're going to move forward with the Weekend of Faith that we want to engage with somewhere between 50 and 100 houses of worship in person and virtually, where houses of worship are currently arranged. And the goal is to have to provide tools for our houses of worship around the city to engage the congregants about the commission's work and how the congregants could be involved in the process. And so my ask to the commissioners today, 2 things. One, if there are houses of worship that we should connect with, plug in with, please let me know. And 2, as we start to figure out the Weekend of Faith, where we want to go, particularly for the in-person, if you are able to commit to speaking at any of the houses of worship, we may line up. Some will be virtual, some will be in person. So I'm asking commissioners to help with that. We're going to have staff out as well. And then also, before I forget, we're going to have other community briefings. We did one a few days ago, which was pretty successful. We had nearly 100 RSVPs and staff-led sessions where we just broke down the report, gave folks a sense of where we are working on as a commission. And so we're looking to do more of that in the near future.
Great.
And then the upcoming commission meetings, we're going to have our next commission meeting on the 16th. Then it's December 3rd and December 15th.
Very, very helpful, Harold. Thank you so much. A couple of things. One, how soon do you want the commission members to get back to you with specifics on houses of worship that they suggest we engage, as well as their availability?
Well, this week will be ideal if commissioners can send at least the houses of worship that we should reach out and participate in the Weekend of Faith. And then, perhaps in a week or 2 from now, as we get a little closer, confirm availabilities on, prefer locations, preferred times, and then I'll work with the commissioners on plugging them into particular houses of worship they can speak at.
Sounds great. I think this is really great and really appreciate your organizing this. Also thinking that I'm sure you're probably building off of some of the weekends of faith that have been done around the vaccine and around census and Thrive. So we
Yes.
probably was okay, good deal, good deal, good deal. And then Harold provided us with the dates for the remaining public commission meetings. Those are critical dates. In these upcoming meetings, we will be both finalizing the preamble as well as centering on the proposals that we'll be putting forward to the electorate that we will vote upon ourselves, and really pay attention to the dates of December 3rd and December 15th. December 3rd may very well be the date when we as a commission vote on the proposals, and December 15th, the review of the proposals, the finalization, or the first crack, I should say, at reviewing them extensively. And December 15th, that the work actually, we're actually going back and forth as I think about it right now. We may put another date in there, the week of December, I guess it would be the week of December 6th. So there will be a commission meeting December 3rd. There may be another commission meeting December 6th. And it may actually be that week of December 6th where we will be voting on proposals in the final report. So we'll come back to you with that. And Harold, you may not have that because there've just been some changes as we look at the schedule to get things done and be wrapped up by December 15th. So I just want you all to be mindful of that and be on the lookout. There may be another meeting that is set for the week of December 6th to make sure that we meet our goals, our set goals for completing the work and completing the report. There are working groups that will continue, and so be on the lookout for those as well. And I can't stress enough, we're in that moment of our work and our process where your attention to the your charter email is critically important, because we are sending information frequently. Like pretty much every day or every other day, we're giving you information, we're giving you briefings, we're giving you updates, and we need you to lean into your charter email so that you can be current, so that when we come together to meet, you're well versed and you have a sense of what we're doing and where we're going, and you're ready to engage. But you all have been great partners thus far, and I'm certain that the work will continue. We're going to wrap up now. I just want to again recognize everybody's efforts heretofore. I want to recognize all of the staff for the work done to complete the interim staff report, the work that you all are continuing to do to make sure that we are hearing from the community and making sure that their voices are critical components of this process and what actually results. And again, I want to thank all of the commissioners for showing up, being a part. We've asked a lot of you, and we're still asking more. But when all is said and done, I believe that we will feel good about the process that we undertook, and know that we have individually and collectively sought to make a difference and to really take a critical step forward in dismantling racism here in New York City. And perhaps that will extend out well beyond. That is my fervent hope. That's my prayer. And I'm just going to tell you that you all are helping to actualize it. So I appreciate everyone. Next commission meeting is November 16th, as was shared, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. We're planning for this to be an in-person meeting. That's a time when we're going to be previewing the public ideas that are going to go into the commission's final report. So I do hope to see all of you there on the 16th. And should you have any questions, never hesitate to reach out to the commission staff or to me, and we'll try to do our best to be responsive. So I want to thank you all again for being with us. I want to thank the public for engaging with us, the community. We're all trying to do our best to produce a product that benefits us all. So thank you. Have a great evening, and the meeting is adjourned.